Donald Trump is both the president of the United States and the leader of the party that believes it cannot survive without voter suppression.
They didn't come out to vote for Hillary. They didn't come out. And that was the big. So thank you to the African-American community. And the African-American community was great to us. They came through big league. Big league. And frankly, if they had any doubt, they didn't vote. And that was almost as good.
The bipartisan members of the Senate Intelligence Committee have released 2 reports today showing that Russia's attack on our presidential election included an attack on African-American voters trying to suppress their vote. According to one of the reports, in the days leading up to the election, Russia's Internet Research Agency began to deploy voter suppression tactics on the black community targeted account. The suppression narratives were targeted almost exclusively at the black community on Instagram and Facebook. Here's Sherilyn Ifill, head of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, with Chris Hayes earlier tonight.
African Americans have to deal with the challenge of voter suppression that is, that comes at us from state and local governments, and since the Trump election, even from the federal government. Now what we're learning is that we have to face voter suppression efforts by foreign governments.
Joining our discussion now, Richard Stengel, former Undersecretary of State in the Obama administration, and Jason Johnson, politics editor at TheRoot.com. Both are MSNBC contributors. And Jason, your reaction to these 2 reports and the targeting of black voters?
I'm not surprised, Lawrence. I mean, this has been going on for a while. You have prominent members of black Twitter who have said for years that you had these sort of hostile bots that were going after active feminists, going after members of the community and sort of sowing discord. But I think it's important to remember that as much as Russia may have tried to exploit existing racial divisions in the country, they were existing racial divisions. Hillary Clinton had her own problems with black people. The Russians did not make her say super predators. The Russians did not make Bernie Sanders say all lives matter at Netroots Nation in 2015. So I think the important thing to remember is, as problematic as foreign intervention is, it is a reflection of pre-existing problems, and Democrats need to be aware of that heading into 2020 to not let this happen again.
Let's take a look at one of the memes that the Russians put out there in social media. It's about voter discouragement. It's about trying to grab onto those elements, those attachment points that Jason was just mentioning, and just in every way they possibly can, discouraging the black vote from turning out. Rick Stengel, when you were Undersecretary of State, one of your jobs was to monitor social media around the world for terrorism, trying to counter terrorism influences on social media. But did you reach over into what the Russians were doing?
Yes, we started the first counter-Russian disinformation unit at the State Department based on what we saw the Russians doing around the annexation of Crimea, going on social media.
So well before the presidential election.
2014, the spring of 2014, we saw that. We saw a kind of tsunami of Russian disinformation and propaganda about what they were doing in Crimea and Ukraine, that they were uniting it. It was part of Russia. So we saw that on social media. I argue in my book that this is a template for what they did in 2016. It was much more successful than they thought it was going to be, and much easier than they thought it to be. So the Internet Research Agency, which has been mentioned, 55 Savushkina Street in St. Petersburg, that's where it is. It's a troll factory. Hundreds of people go in and every day creating content, using bots, using persona. That's what they did to try to suppress the black vote in the election.
Yeah, and Jason, it looks like a scattershot approach, but that's the way social media works. You just fire it out there in every conceivable venue that you possibly can.
Right, and there's a long history of this. Terrell Starr at The Root, Monique Judge at The Root, they've been writing about this for years. I mean, this goes back to the 1960s. The Russians have always seen America's sort of multicultural population as one of the weak points that they could attack us on. They used to approach black activists in the 60s saying, this country will never love you, give us information. Like, this is not new. Social media is just a modern version of it. What I question is this, though. I don't know that this method was necessarily going to be successful if you didn't have the candidates on the table that you had. I don't know that this will work against a Beto O'Rourke. I don't know that this will work against a Joe in 2020. There are lots of different reasons why people choose not to vote. I don't know that I think that these memes were a driving force as much as the people who are running for office.
Yeah, and Rick Stengel, when you look at what they were doing, David Axelrod, who ran 2 successful presidential campaigns for Barack Obama, said today the Trump margin in the Electoral College was so tiny, the way he picked off these small clusters of votes in a couple of states, that this is the kind of thing that could have turned that.
Yes, it's impossible to know. I mean, the thing about the Russians is they're not very creative. They don't create content out of nothing. What they do is they increase sentiment. So what they were trying to do in those places, in those industrial states, increase sentiment for Trump voters to come out and decrease sentiment for Hillary voters to come out. We're not very good at measuring how the internet changes people's minds, but we are pretty good at knowing about whether they increase enthusiasm or decrease it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Jason, we saw the graph showing that the black voter turnout decreased in 2016. First time it's decreased since 1996.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to put down a list, Lawrence, I would say first it was the Voting Rights Act, then a suppression that you had in Wisconsin and Michigan and North Carolina. And I think what a key thing about what the Russia was successful at doing is it ratcheted up white racial anxiety. Because the same way that they were promoting memes in the black community saying, hey, don't vote for these people and Black Lives Matter tells you no, they were pushing out those same extreme memes in the white community saying black people are going to attack, black people are going to take over. So I think there's a sort of synchronicity. There's an organic way that these sorts of things work together. I think the lack of black turnout, though, could probably be pushed primarily to voter suppression. But I really do wonder, going forward, depending on what happens in this country, how effective this is. But I wouldn't doubt that the Russians will simply change to another population, the LGBT community, the Latino community. Racism is always going to be in play in American politics. They'll find some other crease in our society to exploit.
Well,
yeah, the Republicans.
In fact, they have. I mean, if you look at the report today, what they are always trying to do is sow dissent. They're always trying to make the American people feel like the government is not legitimate. So not only did they target black voters, in the report today they targeted LGBT voters, they targeted other people who might be unsympathetic towards the status quo. It's not like they're sympathetic with African Americans or anything like that. They're trying to sow dissent.
But they, Jason, obviously the Republicans, most importantly, did everything they possibly could to suppress the black vote everywhere they possibly could influence that in any way, including reducing polling places, all sorts of things they could do. And then the Russians come in and try to make that vote a bit more reluctant. So if it's become extremely difficult for you to vote, and now you have this Russian social media saying, voting's not that important, those two things taken together could factor in.
Yeah, and also I think we can't forget also the illegal things that Russia was doing of taking people's IDs and starting fake organizations amongst black people to discourage people from voting. I mean, I saw those kinds of memes amongst my very same students, information that wasn't true about Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And the problem that what I really am concerned about is when this is connected in the future, they're going to get more sophisticated. They're going to have people assist them. And when they start putting out false information, if we're not vigilant, if Facebook isn't vigilant, if Twitter isn't vigilant, this is the kind of information that moves faster than you can stop it. And that's what concerns me about black voters. That's what concerns me about anybody, because we already see the voter suppression is not going to stop, and we know that the Russians aren't going to stop by 2020 either.
Rick Stengel and Jason Johnson, thank you both for joining us on this subject.